All right. Thanks for having me. It's good to see everybody. These are always like little reunions. So it's fun to get back. I figure a lot of people in this room could give this talk probably better than I can. So feel free to interrupt me and ask questions as we go. I don't think we necessarily need to wait all the way till the end.
That might go
More?
here in the back.
Good?
I'm talking like you're singing.
Okay. Is that good?
A little bit
Closer? I can't stand. I get videos and audio things that I do to review, and I have to send them to my crew because I can't stand to hear my own voice. I know I'm not the only one, but man, this is hard. Kind of the ick factor. So yeah, thanks for having me. I'm going to try to really do here is set these other folks up, the experts in the Duff and the soils, to give their part. I'll kind of give some context about the why and the how. I brought some copies of a book I did a few years ago, The Fire Manager's Guide. And I know several of you in here already have that, and we have some more ordered, but feel free to grab Sarah and see if you can grab a copy of that. We have a few. I brought about a dozen or so, which should cover everybody, but maybe doesn't have one yet. So yeah, just some context about what I'm referring to today is the southern Blue Ridge, southern Appalachians, extending from Southwest Virginia to all the way down to Northeast Georgia. And it goes without saying, I think a little bit that this is the traditional homeland of the Eastern Band of Cherokee. Just for context, this is traditionally that's the homeland of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. And let's see if I can find the pointer. That's the Qualla boundary, where the reservation, which is all the land that they have remaining. So just some context there was other tribes, obviously, that were up in Western North Carolina that overlapped through different periods, but the one we know best is the Eastern Band of Cherokee. And this is, of course, part of Southern Blue Ridge Fire Learning Network. When we work with partners and amongst different agencies, the Nature Conservancy, U.S. Forest Service, Wildlife Commission, it's always it's through the partnerships we develop with the Southern Blue Ridge FLN. This is about 10 years ago, and actually, I don't think it's on that burn unit they're doing today, but this is the crew down on Andrew Pickens. We have some crew down burning today in Sumter National Forest, 900 acres in Oconee State Park. So I'm going to first go through a little bit about why we burn in the mountains, big picture, and give some context, and then I'll get into how we burn. So it's probably no surprise to most people here. We have a current condition in Appalachian forests that have where fire has been excluded, and different types of human land use patterns have resulted in uncharacteristically dense forest. You can see that either that's a pitch pine or a shortleaf pine there. Amongst that sea of mid-story hardwoods, there's obviously no chance of a southern yellow pine being able to actually germinate or grow from if it did have a patch of sun. It needs about 50% full sunlight in order to grow and meet the photosynthesis demands. Pitch pine, shortleaf pine. Usually pretty devoid of any understory herbaceous component. Of course, that's what the Southern Appalachians is really known for, is its biodiversity, and all of that is really locked up in this understory, where folks like Zach's here, Zach from Southeast Grasslands Initiative, he can expert botanist that can identify all the plants in the understory, and he'll hopefully there'll be some mostly dormant today, but I'm glad you're here, Zach. And we're talking about this term. It gets you'll hear it a lot as you read more in the literature, the mesification, which is generally a mesophyte, is a plant that favors moist growing, shaded, cool growing conditions. Make sure you don't get this confused with misophonia. That's really embarrassing because this is when you can't stand the sound of people chewing or throat clearing or repetitive sounds. So don't get that confused. But this condition, white oak, is just an example of one of the species that suffers, and why we're not getting very much regeneration, because white oak and most oaks generally require about 30% full sunlight in order to. You'll always see the seedlings, and I think seedlings can hang out in that stage for 10 to 20 or 20 or more years, and but they won't ever grow if there's not enough full sun, not enough sunlight to meet the photosynthesis demands. So we're suffering from. Still got a lot of mature oaks, but very few in that sort of middle age range that are really, when a canopy gap opens up, say the hurricane or ice storm, there's really very few oaks in a competitive position that will get up into the canopy to be the next generation of oaks. So that's what this mesification process is resulting in. A lot of shade tolerant species that have hung out in the understory, like red maple, they're poised to dominate the overstory. I just published a paper with Bryce Hanbury that where we looked back in the early 1900s, some of the land surveys that show that at about that time, our southern Appalachian forests, specifically northeast Georgia, is what we were looking at, were 50% oak, and now and only like 1% maple. Now it's more 15% maple of all tree species, and oaks are down to about 25%, represent 25% of the canopy. So that's a general trend. Chestnut was in there at like 10%, I think, and of course it's down to 0. But we have a lot of good evidence and information about historic conditions of Appalachian forests. Some from early European explorers that came over and kind of came across this more open oak system generally. A lot of stuff, cove forests and things that are not necessarily fire dependent or fire adapted, were still more dense forests, but there was a decent component. Probably if you look over at the overall the southern Appalachians, you can consistently, general trend is about 50% of the landscape is what you would consider oak dominated, or has some role of fire with it that occurs periodically through time. Did you bring any of this book, Lindsay? Yeah. Okay. Well, this is another free PDF. It's probably so you can get, but really good book if you want to dig more into read more about fire history in the Appalachians and learn how the soil charcoal and tree ring studies. It's a free PDF. You can just search fire history of the Appalachian region. But
this is one of the ones on our website that's full PDF. So if you can just search up cat bounce or Portugal Appalachian, it'll be right there.
Yeah. And so yeah, so anyway, a lot of research has gone into these fire scar studies where they can, when a pine tree is young, it can get exposed to fire, it'll get this scar, which then throughout the rest of its life will be able to record the scars of fires. And so we've been able to glean a lot of information about how frequently fire occurred historically, or at least over the last 400 to 500 years when we find really old trees. I think Don Hagen was telling me recently that he's got a tree down on Tallulah Gorge State Park that has 17 fire scars, a Table Mountain pine. So that's really cool, and I'm interested to hear more about that. But basically, what we can do then is model how often fire occurred historically. So you can kind of see in this. The darker colors, red is mean fire return interval at once every 4 years. And, it's overlaps pretty consistently with the cloud to ground, average cloud to ground lightning flashes per year, with that epicenter sort of down here where that Gulf moisture comes up and generates a lot of thunderstorms and lightning, and definitely a lot more lightning ignited fires down in northern Florida and southwest Georgia. And so you're able to pattern sort of approximately how long, how often fire occurred historically in the southern Appalachians and throughout the southern U.S. This is one of my favorite books. I like to, I read this a lot of different times, but it goes through the different, ecoregions of the United States and talks about the different ways that indigenous people use fire, whether it was for driving game. Here, is largely a function of promoting plant species that were critically important to the Cherokee and other indigenous people. The ones that rank highly, I think, would be white oak, which they use for baskets and for structures and various things. Blueberries for sure. All of these things are light. Not necessarily, I wouldn't call them fire dependent, but they depend on high light conditions. So in the absence of fire or manually cutting trees mechanically, they're going to suffer. Blueberries, if they're too shaded, any of you that grow blueberries, if it's too much shade, they're not going to flower and they're not going to set fruit. And so that's a common issue across our southern Appalachian forest. It's a real pretty place in Southeast Tennessee, Foothills Wildlife Management Area, which is managed by the Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency. Real pretty place near, I think, down near Tellico Plains in that area. Shortleaf pine, what I would call a savanna. And you can see it's not all grasses, it's forbs, it's mid-story hardwoods in there. So a lot of different vertical structural diversity, which we know is important for a lot of different species, especially, one thing we've lost because of lack of this is northern bobwhite. And not only do they require that open understory for foraging, but they also actually, a lot of their problem is not having hardwoods in the winter to have winter cover. They're not super hardy birds, pretty susceptible. Here's South Mountains Game Lands, Wildlife Resource Commission out near Morganton. Real pretty dry oak woodland that's where it's been shelter wood cut and burned. You can talk to Dean and Ryan and more about that today. Real pretty shortleaf oak woodland. These are places that what I think closely represent our historic fire adapted or historic conditions and structure and vegetation composition. This is a site with smooth coneflower called Pine Mountain. It's down on the Andrew Pickens. A lot of pictures are from Andrew Pickens, and we're down there today because they end up burning a lot down there along the southern Blue Ridge Escarpment. Here's another shot. You can see it's not one. If you're used to looking at longleaf wiregrass, we don't necessarily have one picturesque portrait of what a reference condition is or what we're shooting for. It's variable largely because our terrain is so variable. Our topography is so different. So you get different disturbance regimes, different fire events. This is a place I manage up in Ashe County. It's a high elevation oak woodland. Bill Leatherwood's been up there a couple times with me. You can see some northern red oak in the understory and really high, highly diverse understory. 5,000, that's about 5,000 feet elevation. This is Chestnut Mountain in Northeast Georgia on the Chattahoochee National Forest, another place where they've done a lot of burning. And this is up there at that Bluff Mountain again. This is a real pretty pine oak heath site over in Southeast Tennessee, south zone of the Cherokee National Forest. This is called the Gravel Stand Unit. So this one actually has a fun, interesting history, and it's just had it had a period where 30 or 40 years it was arson fires every year, which is why it looks so good. He just light it off the bottom and let it rip. So the Forest Service has continued with burning to try to maintain that. And here's one of our favorite places, Zach. This is Catoosa Wildlife Management Area that's got a lot of really cool plants. It's much different than it used to be. It used to be all shortleaf until the pine beetle outbreak, or not all shortleaf, but much more predominantly shortleaf. But just a gorgeous place to go find out look at what we're shooting for. But what we have today, of course, the forest we see today is not just a function of fire exclusion. It's a bunch of different things. Namely, when we I talked about how indigenous people used fire, but of course, when we showed up, when European settlements started in late 1500s, I believe, is when we introduced disease, and that's when really the amount of fire and the indigenous footprint really started to decline, and it has continued. Then we lost the passenger pigeon later in the 1800s. that's a funny one because it's hard to tell, but because we talk, when we look at forests and forest structure, we think about all these disturbances and these processes. We think about fire mostly. We think about ice storms and wind storms, but passenger pigeons were actually a big one. Um, by all accounts, there was a significant amount of, the size of the flocks, and the damage that they would do to tree crowns, was pretty significant. And it's hard to know how that interacts, how these disturbances interact. I keep wondering, it's been a fascinating few years here for disturbances and compounding disturbances because, we've got conditions in some places on Pisgah and others where you have this heavy amount of downed fuel from the wind event in Helene. And it's reminiscent of like the early 1900s when we had industrial logging and basically clear cut everything. So we're going to have super intense fires that will eventually come, depending on when those conditions manifest. We're on the verge of it, sort of, as we speak, kind of tiptoeing around a drought a little bit. Chestnut is another big one that's just absent. He's just a huge part of our forests. The fascinating paper that came out a few years ago, which said that which showed that chestnut leaves are actually more flammable than oak leaves. They ignite more readily, which is pretty damn fascinating because we don't really necessarily know the full extent of the role of chestnut and as far as what types of forest of what types of our ecosystem or ecozones that it occurred in. But it certainly seems to would have carried fire or contributed to fire behavior. So, and presumably when, you looked at that foothills wildlife management area picture, when things were more open, that would have definitely stimulated more forbs and warm season grasses, which are significantly change fire behavior. So we would have overall had a more receptive fuel bed in general. And then, of course, we get to that 1800s, late 1800s, and the non-native invasive species. And, that late 1800s is when the industrial logging made its way down to the Southern Appalachians. And that's when we sort of started the, U.S. Forest Service and our fire exclusion or fire suppression era right around that early 1900s. So, that's really when our forests really started to get really dense. 1910 is kind of that year that folks point to as that 3 million acre fire in Idaho. I wonder how I played this. What's that? Steve, think again. Yeah. I brought this for Armin. This is just one little clump of miscanthus. And you can tell how is it gonna work?
Oh, you guys aren't seeing it. I was watching it and it looks really good. Yes, I can switch that over.
Sorry, I didn't know it was gonna be a pain.
No, it's all right. I practiced for this.
Oh, good. Yeah, so Bill Leatherwood will tell you about fighting with miscanthus fires. This is just one clump, but Madison County's chock full of this, and this is what I said an Armin studying this out at Green River Game Lands where we're going today. And as we're driving out, depending on where we're going, you'll see some of the roadsides that are colonized by this, but that's how it burns. And that's just one example. It's cheatgrass out west. You go different places and you'll have a different species that non-native invasive plant that's really changing fire behavior one way or the other. Thank you. What's that?
You just tap on it and you.
Sorry.
No, it's fine.
Video.
Kind of like in the swallows, saying it's a grass, basic grass, but growing in with the Warwick cactuses, and it burns.
That I don't know. There's probably folks in here like Greg. But yeah, if you pick the ecosystem, it's gonna there's gonna be some form or fashion where fire suppression has led to greater hardwood encroachment and more intense fires. In our case, it's less frequent fires because the fuel bed's not as receptive. But when it does burn, it burns really hot, which is kind of what we're going to get into with the Duff. Duff. I remember in 2016 there was a lot of people were able to stand down in the holes 5-6 feet deep where the Duff burned down during our 2016 fall fire season. But anyway, that's what it looked like in the early 1900s after that industrial logging. And all I bring that up for is just to give context for why we are where we are. And so I talk a lot about the fire exclusion because that's one of the disturbances that we can control or we can manage and we can put back in a controlled manner. But certainly historically what we had was a frequent low intensity fire regime, and we have a totally different fire regime now, which is infrequent and high intensity. So, just kind of transitioning a little bit to about how we burn a little bit and kind of the link between why and how. If you when we talk about our management goals, fire fits in with our stewardship goals. That we don't do fire necessarily for fire's sake. So if you were to break it down, and this is going to vary by agency. Certainly, I think a lot of funding that comes through the federal government is for reducing hazardous fuels as a management goal, as a reason for burning. TNC, we in the Fire Learning Network, we tend to favor that more ecosystem management. If you get down into possibly like North Carolina Sandhills or Southwest Georgia, you're going to get into more focal species management, where you have specific areas that are managed for either northern bobwhite or turkeys. And so those are some of the broad management goals that we have for burning. And you can see why, obviously, here, reducing hazardous fuels is a big one. This is, this is not extreme conditions. This is prescribed burn conditions, and that's what mountain laurel tends to burn like. And so we got a huge issue, especially as we have more and more houses being built along the ridges and in the midst of where this mountain laurel grows and where fire is typically the most intense. So we're going to keep getting hopefully getting funding for reducing hazardous fuels. But the fire manager's guide that I was talking about and the ecosystem management approach is sort of focused on these major eco zones. We think about on the highest ridges or the driest ridges, that pine oak heath that you get with Table Mountain pine and pitch pine. This book is broken into these 4 chapters. Lower elevations in the foothills, transition areas start to get into shortleaf pine oak and then all different sort of moisture regimes of oak forest. So, and I think we'll see aspects with the exception of the high elevation red oak. You'll see all of these aspects of all of these in at Green River Game Lands today. So it's not like these are wide open and separate conditions. They're blended together. So it points at the Southern Blue Ridge Escarpment, and you can kind of get an idea of that's fire return intervals over there. Sort of the warmer colors are, more frequent fire, or what we would expect historically based on the biophysical settings. We're actually right here close to the Southern Blue Ridge Escarpment, which is typically when you look at the Southern Blue Ridge, it's a lot of the most fire adapted stuff is around the perimeter of the southern Appalachians, not necessarily interior where you get into more high elevation, a little cooler stuff. So, beginning about October, November, we start to get these Canadian high pressure systems that move down these cold fronts. I think we're supposed to get rain on Thursday. I mean, as an example, we would typically get that rain front, and our burning usually occurs 2 to 3 days after that front passes through. The leaf litter dries out enough with a little bit of wind, and we're set up for pretty good burn conditions with our northerly winds, usually getting humidities down in the 20s and 30s. So we get a handful of those days per year where we get sunny conditions. In a lot of our burning in the eco zones, the way those shortleaf pine oak and the forests are distributed is largely a function of landform position. You can look at a landform map and you can kind of predict what's going to be there. Certainly, we spend a lot of time lighting and focusing on ridges, those convex surfaces that shed water. This is going to have implications for duff depth and duff moisture. Typically, our drier sites where the depth of the water table is such that a lot of maples and those mesophytic species have trouble competing. And they tend to focus more, a lot of our cove forests are much more in these concave places that are depositional surfaces where soil erodes off, and those are not places we really focus on. Places like bottom of Hickory Nut Gorge, they're just not necessarily fire adapted places. They would experience fire once every 100 years, but with only so many burn days a year, we have to, of course, prioritize where we burn. So just some terms you may hear sometimes is that really to when we predict, what we're trying to do when we go out and we look at these sites is we try to get an idea of what the potential natural vegetation is. And we do that by understanding and modeling these factors. Basically, what we've found so far is that elevation and soil chemistry are two huge factors in being able to predict what the site should be. Everything we have has been cut over or farmed or any number of things that humans have done to it. So it's hard to tell what should be there sometimes, but you can get a real good idea when you know your landform position, your aspect, and all of these main factors. And all those factors are what we would come to call the biophysical setting. And by knowing the biophysical setting, we can predict what the potential natural vegetation is. So if the disturbance regime was intact, if fire had not been excluded and it had not been touched by, if we had not manipulated it mechanically or industrially or otherwise, this is what it would tend to be. And so we use that to inform how we ignite places and how we actually burn places. Generally our goal when we go out and the work that we support and the burning that we do on TNC lands is restoring open structure in those fire adapted eco zones, restoring top killing some of that mid-story hardwood and shrub components so that the forbs and grasses are able to come back. And generally speaking, you got really three types of fire behavior. Essentially, what we use a lot of the time is backing fire. That's where we have the most control. Typically, the arrows sort of direct indicate upslope wind, which is what drives our fire behavior. A lot of times, my counterparts in longleaf, they're dependent on the general winds for the day as to where they set up and start the fire. You have the most control, of course, when you burn into the wind. Certainly the least control is when you have a head fire. And we use that sometimes on certain occasions in different patterns, but a lot of times this is the case when wind is driving the fire and it's driving head fire and it's building steam and getting more and more intense as it climbs up the slope. Kind of in the middle ground is what we use as flanking fire, which is burning into the wind and allowing fire to sort of move across the slope. Depending on how things are burning a particular day or what our goals are for the site, flanking fire is a really good option, and it's one we're always really trying to achieve a moderate intensity, just because once the hardwoods that we're trying to kill, once it gets about 3 inches DBH, it's really hard to kill with regular low to moderate intensity fire. So in some cases, we'll need to take steps to increase the intensity using the wind in various ways. So a lot of times our slope wind, or all the time, pretty much our slope wind dominates our general wind. That it's pretty dependable that every day sun comes up and the earth gets warm, that warm air is going to start, the air is going to start rising upslope. So we can predict, a year, 2, 3 years in advance where our anchor point is going to be, where we're going to start, because it's going to be usually at the top of the hill, the highest point, so we can work down. My counterparts in longleaf, it just depends on the wind of the day. They may start in this corner or that corner, depending on the wind direction that day. So it's a little bit different animal. And you can look at a topo map a lot of times, and you can actually tell the red is the kind of the ridges, but that's where our fire adapted eco zones are. That's where our pine and oak dominated stuff is typically located. So you don't necessarily need to have an eco zone map. You can make a pretty good guess if it's a convex surface and it's not up in the clouds where you got spruce fir at 6,000 feet in northern hardwoods, or down in the protected cove forest that sometimes don't see sunlight. It's probably going to have oaks on it, and it's probably going to be conducive to burning. So, we start that day at that anchor point with some black lining operation using backing fire, moderate to low intensity. It might get up to 300 degrees, but typically we're trying to keep it moderate and let it back into the unit. This is an interesting. These different eco zones are going to have different Duff components that we'll get into discussing later, but this is one place that's a concern. It's got a lot of pine and oak stuff that doesn't decompose super rapidly, so and it dries out faster. This is these convex surfaces, so they dry out real quick. But that's a lot of where our oaks and our fire adapted stuff is, and so we continue to let fire back off of our fire line and into the unit, and it can vary. It's backing through oak litter. In this case, it's kind of a denser, more maple type of litter, and so it's a little bit lower intensity. Where you have good oak litter and certainly pine needle cast and warm season grasses, you can crank that. The backing fire will be a little bit more intense. I think this is Thurman Chatham game lands, where kind of a piney, oaky, dry oak ridge with chestnut oak and it's been burned once or twice before, so it's a little bit more open, and you have even a little bit of a forb component in there. But we generally, again, focus on those upslope winds. We've got those. There are a lot of times they're funneled in the draws. So as long as we stay high on these spur ridges, we're in pretty good shape. Try to stay out of lighting in the chimneys. You get this chimney effect in those draws where the winds are a little bit funnel up a little bit faster. So we try to let fire back and flank off into those as it wants to. We don't really focus on those, but to expedite things and get the smoke up and out, we'll may use strip head fires where we kind of come across the slope in different intervals. We may use strips, but it could just as well be dots. Strips of 1, 2, 3 pattern where the top lighter is out in front and second lighter and third lighter. These are terms you might hear, but strip head fire is when we would use head fire. But so you've got the fire backing down, and so the strip that you're lighting, even though it is head fire, it can only get so intense before it runs into the backing fire, the black, and then there's nothing left to burn because it's going into black. You can space out those strips, and you can crank up the heat. You go out to Linville Gorge and places like that, you have to be a little bit more careful because with these mountain laurel stands, mountain laurel is crazy because it holds onto its dead stems, and so and I don't know why it does that. It's kind of curious whether that's a strategy to create to promote high intensity fire. Either way, especially in the spring here in another month, it's going to get that waxy coating on it where it's the fresh leaves, and it's just going to you can't give it too much slope or it's going to burn hot, and you're going to have you're going to create heavier tree mortality. And now we've got these oak crowns that are down in this stuff in places, especially on the grandfather, and that's going to send embers way farther than what we typically can anticipate. So we definitely got our work cut out for us, and that's where TNC is going to be working in the next couple of years, is really looking at these fire lines, and we're going to have to rethink where those are and how big they are and where our contingency lines are, because that's going to be a real volatile place. So yeah, strip head fires, and like I said, you could come across that slope with dots too. It's one of these things where it's trying to strips, or you can't put the genie back in the bottle. You when you go with dots, you can let those dots come together slowly, and whereas a strip is gonna be hot. That's gonna be your hottest way you can light it. When we try to achieve a flanking fire, though, we might just pick out those ridges, and a lot of times once we got the top blacked in, got good black up there, we'll come straight downhill, straight down the ridges to get that moderate intensity, and typically burn those places where oak and the pine are. We still, that upslope wind helps us with moderating our fire behavior. And there are days where a head fire may be needed. This once or twice I can remember, they were just kind of overcast days and the fire would not back or flank, and so we did have to switch to head fire. But for the most part, this ridgeline ignition, you can get up to achieve a medium intensity. And of course, when you're doing those ridge lines downhill, again, you can dial it back a little bit and go with dots rather than strips, and you can try to achieve that medium to low intensity. It's these are techniques, but it's in the mountains, especially, it's just so variable that you just have to see what's working that day based on the forecasted conditions, and then what you see when you get out there. Heck, you may be burning so hot, especially with some of these Helene fuels, or maybe in a place like Grandfather Ranger District or in the escarpment where it's dry and tends to burn hot. I mean, we just may have to let it back. And the challenge with that is that a lot of the reason we try to expedite things is because at night, the smoke will get trapped by the inversion. So if we're not done burning by 4 or 5, 6 o'clock, everything's going to get trapped and go to the downstream to the nearest city. And it's going to be a lot of complaints and a lot of inconveniences for people, especially with breathing problems and in urban areas that we have increasingly. So that may be one of the things we have to work on. I've kind of felt personally that, the better we can talk to the public in places like this and other ways to get them ready for that overnight burning and those smoke impacts, I think that's going to be a big deal, because at some level we are going to have to let some of this stuff burn, and it's going to go for multiple days. And I think we'll do it and prescribe burning where we can, but certainly we're not going to be able to get to all of it before the wildfires do get it. And then it's burning on nature's terms and not on ours, and we're just more in a reactive mode, more so than proactive. You could do different strategies on the same burn. It's not all one or the other. It's on one side of the unit, you may be on a northerly aspect, and you may need to it's cooler and damper over there, so you may need strips or even head fires. But then you may swap over to the south and west side, and dots may be your best option. But depending, these interaction factors, these understanding of the eco zones, and that's what I talk about with my crew, and that's my mentors that are, most of them are here today, that really have that expertise in ecology and operations. That's the two sides of what we do. That's my goal, is what I think of as, being a wildland fire professional is balancing those two things. Having the social skills and some emotional intelligence in dealing with people and managing teams, but having that understanding of the ecology and the operations is really critical in Southern Appalachians, because it's so nuanced and so different. It just depends. It depends is the phrase that you always, when you get questions about this stuff. So that's really all I had. I wanted to kind of link up the how and the why. We're trying to preserve these oak forests and the plants, the rare plants that are in the understory, and certainly the declining grassland songbirds. And I brought another book called Considerations for Fire and Wildlife, and I talked about that focal species management goal. And if that was your if you were more interested in a focal species approach here, then that would be more of a better guide. The fire manager's guide is much more of an ecosystem management approach. So, but I think I have a couple minutes for questions, right?
Yeah, you get a round of applause for Adam.
You got like 7 minutes for questions. Any questions for Adam?
Or comments or corrections. Criticisms is fine. Yeah.
How have your operations sort of changed or Duff accumulation changed with all of the down debris from Hurricane Helene?
That's a good question. I don't know that I would say that it's contributed to the Duff yet, but I do think that there's some level of mortality that you have to expect. You can do the work on the front end with chainsaws, and you can go in and what I'm talking about is these oak tree crowns, especially the ones that are suspended above ground. They've already dried out and they burn really hot and likely will girdle a mature live tree that it's next to, unless you cut it out. So you have to choose one or the other. So there's more work, I think, on the front end in preparing fire lines, not necessarily as it's related to Duff, but that will contribute in future years. Right now, we're certainly worried about the vegetation that's above ground, but it could change the dynamic in how fast that Duff dries out. It certainly once, when you have these big jackpots of fuels, if it sits there and cooks, what in a normal prescribed burn, what may just carry on through, it's going to preheat that. It will preheat that Duff, and it will dry out that organic layer, and it could create, Duff issues where they weren't typically, where they wouldn't typically be expected.
As root balls.
Root balls, yep.
So
That's a good point.
Balls that like normally wouldn't ignite as easily, but since you got these giant root balls that are suspended, everywhere else the Duff's not burning, but these root balls are, some of them huge. And
Yeah.
they'll be right on the line. You can't really mitigate around them. And now you've got this Duff that will burn forever.
That's a good point. And it's suspended. A lot of this stuff, these fuels, some of these tree crowns are suspended, and that's a whole different animal. Usually you've got some interaction of soil, ground moisture, keeping things damp and but when it's suspended, that creates even more issues. And it's going to be interesting. It's going to be a perpetual problem because some trees are still alive. And so some trees that are dead, the crowns may burn now, but others may take a few years to die and be available. So we're going to be digging out for a long time, and we'll see what we can get to and manage and mitigate before the next drought happens and the next wildfire type of season happens, which could be anytime. Certainly, yeah.
Have you ever considered utilizing Duff consumption as a strategy to impact mesophytic hardwoods in those drier habitats?
Hey, Adam.
Yes.
Could you just repeat that question so that the people on the area as well have questions?
Yeah. Using the Duff depth that's accumulated in an era of fire exclusion to manage, to create mortality, burn and get some fire going it would be if your stand was ubiquitous with mesophytic hardwoods. But the problem is you've got your oaks and stuff mixed in there as well. That's the thing with the thing that makes burning in the Appalachians so challenging, rather than so compared to longleaf, where you have a lot of a single species that's highly fire adapted. We've got so many different ones, and so many different bark thicknesses and different wood that and it's all mixed together. And Duff's the same way. It's just real hard. You got to when you tend to go to that level of specificity, you got to get out the chainsaw. You got to do some mechanical selection. It's hard to selectively thin with fire, be it Duff or trying to kill the above ground hardwoods. But I wouldn't necessarily rule anything like that out. I wouldn't rule anything out. Armin?
Can I ask that real quick?
Yeah.
The one thing about
So a lot of them as big species, they don't really accumulate dust. They're different fungal associated. So they're a busted microrhizal and they don't really form as much dust.
Yeah.
We're gonna talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of times the pine and the oaks, they're so full of tannins that the microorganisms can't get down there and break them down as fast. Maple and poplar and stuff, it decomposes so rapidly. Just how you can pick it up and it just crumbles in your hand, and that's why it won't carry fire, and that's why you can't get it to really burn at anything more than a super low intensity creeping fire. It just doesn't have that tannins in stuff that slows down that decomposition process.
All right.
Yep.
We can do one more. You're good.
One more?
Yeah.
Do you run into any sites that might already have an invasive species, particularly understory species, or are close to this invasion vector that you might otherwise want to burn in a specific way, but you're afraid that burning is going to increase the invasion?
Yeah, and we're going to see that at Green River Game Lands today. I think that's pretty much what Armin's graduate work is largely about, as I understand it, is miscanthus, and it's a light loving species, and so presumably I worry about its contribution to high intensity wildfires because presumably with a closed canopy, a 95% forest canopy cover, it's in a suppressed state. It's usually, if you find it in the woods, it's largely fallen over and it's not really vigorous and robust. But man, the ones that grow out in the open are just huge plants and they burn like that one did. And you're talking about huge fields. So yeah, we've seen managers that create more problems when they go in and do clearing, or timber harvest when there's invasives in the understory. Especially the miscanthus is the only one I feel like we have that really ramps up fire behavior. A lot of the other stuff is actually like Japanese stilt grass. I think it kind of limits, suppresses fire behavior to some extent. So yeah, and that's another one. If you open up the canopy, you have minor problems, and you open up the canopy before you treat it, you're gonna have even worse problems. That's a great question.
We've got one question from Zoom.
Yep.
It's from David Godwin, and he just to clarify, the Duff after Hurricane Helene, is the Duff drier, and is it from the canopy being more open, or do you see the Duff being drier after Hurricane Helene?
Yeah, that's a great question. Definitely. Yeah, I think, man, I'm always am amazed at just doing a prescribed burn. It's got to be, research is really fire research in the mountains is really difficult because over a given 500-acre unit, everything is so variable. And even over the course of a day, it's variable because when that sun comes out and it hits a spot, that fire behavior ramps up. It always surprises me how much different it is when you have a thin layer of clouds versus a clear blue sky. So yes, the Duff direct sunlight is going to make that Duff more exposed. And thinking on south aspects and western aspects that generally get more sun, I would expect those to be even more the Duff to even more readily ignite.
One more round of applause for Adam.
Thank you.